It was the kind of morning where the air felt too peaceful, like nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to ruin it. That someone turned out to be Karen. I was sipping coffee on the back porch, watching my 13-year-old son Leo haul up the final plank of what he'd been calling Fort Freedom. A full-fledged 2-story treehouse built entirely by him, his friends, and a few hundred YouTube tutorials. They even painted it like a ranger outpost, complete with a solar panel and a crank winch for a rope bridge. It was brilliant. It was harmless. And according to Karen, it was an egregious violation of HOA vertical zoning aesthetics. Whatever that meant. I saw her before I heard her. She stormed across our shared property line, sweat already pooling on her temple beneath her frizzled blonde perm. HOA-issued polo stretched tight across her chest like it was doing overtime just to hold her fury in. She had that classic mix of smugness and outrage that only someone with absolutely no real power but way too much free time could master. In her hand was a clipboard. Always the clipboard. That thing might as well have been her sword. "This is a violation," she snapped before even reaching the base of the tree, jabbing the air like she was swatting an invisible bee made of offense. "It obstructs my view of the sunset." I blinked. "You live 2 houses down. How tall are your sunsets? This affects property values. It's in our backyard. And visible from the trail. People walk their dogs here. Children might see it." "You mean children might see a treehouse and get ideas?" "I'm calling the police." Now, a normal person might have laughed. I didn't. I just nodded and sipped my coffee. "Go ahead." She did. Right there on speakerphone, stomping in a circle, and holding her phone high like the signal had to be pulled down from the heavens. Leo leaned over the railing of Fort Freedom, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Should I put up the No Karens Allowed sign now or after they get here?" Karen practically vibrated with rage. "You think this is a joke? I'm reporting this structure and your delinquent son." We didn't have to wait long. Sirens hooped down the street not 3 minutes later, which honestly impressed me. 2 squad cars pulled into our driveway, and for a moment, Karen beamed like a proud little snitch who had finally made it big. But that moment didn't last. Out stepped Officers Diaz and Tran. Both tall. Both fit. Both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. And both very, very familiar with Karen. Diaz tipped his sunglasses down. "Hi again, Karen." She lit up. "Thank you for coming. They've built a compound in a tree. That child is unsupervised with power tools. I demand a citation and immediate teardown." Tran muttered something under his breath. I caught the word hobbyhorse. I stood and walked toward them, taking my time. "Morning, officers. Coffee?" They shook their heads in unison, both staring up at the treehouse. Leo gave them a 2-finger salute from the top. Diaz looked at Karen. "This is what you called in? You do realize 911 is for emergencies." "It is an emergency. It's a code violation." "No, it's a kid being creative on his own property." Karen's face went through 3 shades of indignation before landing on something close to betrayal. "You're supposed to be impartial." Tran finally sighed and said, "Ma'am, do you know who this man is?" Karen narrowed her eyes at me like I'd just been outed as some undercover villain. Diaz answered for her. "His brother is our police chief. And his father, well, his father used to own this building before the precinct bought it." Karen froze. "What?" I smiled, savoring the stillness. "Fun fact. The deed to the original building your HOA now rents its office space from? My family used to own that too." "You're bluffing." Diaz shrugged. "We call him the landlord." Karen turned crimson. She opened her mouth, closed it, then pointed wildly at the tree. "This isn't over." She spun on her heel and stormed back across the lawn, nearly twisting her ankle on the stepping stones Leo had laid the week before. The officers chuckled quietly. "I'll be filing a complaint with the HOA," she yelled as she stomped off. "That's cute," I said. "They rent their office from my cousin now." Tran actually laughed. As they walked back to their cruisers, Diaz paused. She's probably gonna dig into everything now. You might want to brace for a paper war. I nodded. Let her dig. I've got deeper shovels. Sure enough, by the next morning, Karen had taken to the HOA Facebook group like it was her own personal court docket. Claims ranged from unlicensed construction to child endangerment to alleged terroristic aesthetics of the treehouse color scheme. She used words like militia and compound to describe what was essentially a boy's dream fort with a Nerf turret. She included grainy photos taken from 2 blocks over, red-circled like a conspiracy theorist trying to solve a pigeon theft. But the best part? She CC'd the local news. And they bit. A tiny local cable segment showed up with a camera crew to investigate the unauthorized tactical structure built by a middle schooler. Karen gleefully walked them through her concerns, dramatically pausing beneath the treehouse to say, "No child should have this much unregulated power." The news anchor turned to Leo, who wore his scout uniform for the interview and talked about how he used the build to complete his engineering merit badge. The segment aired that evening. Karen looked unhinged. Leo looked like a genius. The comments section exploded. Which is how Karen made her next move. Desperate to reclaim control, she called for an emergency HOA board meeting. She claimed it was to address growing threats to community standards and safety, but everyone knew it was about the treehouse. I went, obviously. So did half the neighborhood, mostly to see the drama unfold. The meeting was held in the HOA's tiny rented conference space, a bland beige box in the plaza across from the police station. Karen sat at the front table flanked by 2 other board members, Doug, who was basically a decorative fern in khakis, and Stephanie, whose idea of leadership was agreeing with whoever was loudest. Karen banged her gavel, yes, she brought a gavel, and launched into a tirade about rule enforcement and youth delinquency. Leo sat next to me, arms crossed, eyes twinkling. I waited until the end of her rant, then stood up slowly and said, "I'd like to address the board." Karen scowled. "This isn't a Q&A. "No, but this is a matter of interest to the HOA leaseholder." There was a ripple of confusion. I pulled out a copy of the rental agreement. "As of last month, the space you're in was transferred to a new holding company. My wife's." Karen's jaw actually dropped. "We sent notice to the board, but apparently it got lost under the urgent pigeon surveillance reports." I let the silence marinate. Then I added, "So I'd like to propose a new community initiative. It's called Leave My Kid Alone. We'll be raising funds for it at Fort Freedom's ribbon-cutting ceremony. You're all invited." I turned to leave, Leo at my side. Behind us, Karen's voice cracked as she stammered, You can't do this." I didn't even turn around. "Oh, Karen. We already did." The next morning, I found a neon orange sign duct-taped to our mailbox post. It wasn't a city-issued tag or even a formal HOA document. It was a Word doc printed on what looked like Karen's home printer, complete with typos and clip art. It read, "Stop work order. Violation of Tree Height Bylaw 7C. Structure to be demolished immediately." Underneath it was her signature in Sharpie, which she'd underlined 3 times for emphasis. Leo saw it before I did and thought it was a prank. "She used Comic Sans," he muttered. "She should be the one arrested." I peeled the sign off, smoothed it out, and tucked it into my file folder labeled Karen's Greatest Hits. It was getting thick. That afternoon, she went door to door trying to rally neighbors against the treehouse. From what I gathered later, she led with phrases like an eyesore, a safety hazard, and a breeding ground for delinquent ideologies. Only Karen could make a pine-scented clubhouse sound like a terrorist cell. She even dragged a tape measure from house to house, trying to prove that Fort Freedom broke height ordinances. Never mind the fact that the HOA had no jurisdiction over trees taller than the house itself, and we'd built it within the canopy of an existing one. Technicalities were never her strength. Volume was. Around 6 p.m., I got a knock at the door. It wasn't Karen this time, it was Stephanie, the board secretary. She stood there awkwardly, holding a clipboard like it was a cross between a bomb and a peace offering. "Hey," she said, chewing her lip. "Just wanted to, bring by this citation notice." Karen insisted. I took it without opening it. "You agree with her?" She hesitated. "Not totally. But she's got Doug convinced, and he's treasurer now, so." "So spineless is contagious?" Stephanie winced. "Look, just show up at the board review tomorrow, okay? You can fight it there. Will snacks be provided?" She blinked. "Excuse me. Because if I'm going to a clown show, I'd at least like popcorn." She didn't laugh, but she didn't argue either. She turned and walked off, clearly regretting her errand duties. I unfolded the citation. Another word doc. This one cited vague infractions like visual obstruction, noise potential, and pre-military aesthetic influence, whatever that meant. At the bottom, a sentence was underlined in red. Treehouse must be removed within 48 hours or fines of $500 per day will be issued. I brought it inside, showed Leo, and said, "Guess it's time we play a little longer game." We arrived early to the board review. The room had all the tension of a parole hearing and none of the dignity. Karen sat at the center, flanked by Doug and Stephanie. She'd brought a laptop this time and was setting up a projector. Never trust someone with a personal PowerPoint. She clicked the first slide. A blurry photo of Fort Freedom taken from behind a bush, annotated with arrows and text boxes. Excessive height, one label screamed. Another read, "Suspicious rope mechanism, possible pulley trap." I held up my hand. "Did you just accuse my son of building a medieval torture device?" Karen ignored me and advanced to the next slide. A close-up of Leo in his scout uniform. "Unauthorized uniform," she said, as if announcing an international crime. "Military adjacent. Could cause alarm." "Ma'am," I said calmly, "he's 12. That's a merit badge sash, not an insurgency starter kit." Murmurs broke out in the small audience of residents. Most were clearly here for the spectacle. A few were Karen's inner circle of gossip warriors. But several others, I noticed, were people who had actually helped Leo's, offering scrap lumber, lending tools, or just dropping by to encourage him. Doug cleared his throat. "Let's just hear both sides." Karen spun toward him, offended. "Both sides? You saw the zip line. It's a pulley for hoisting up sandwiches," I said. "It's called innovation." Stephanie rubbed her temples. "Let's move on. Mr. Grant, do you have a defense prepared?" "Just some evidence," I said, pulling a thick envelope from my bag. I handed out copies to each board member. "Permit from the county showing the structure is within legal bounds. Letter from our property attorney confirming the HOA bylaws don't govern treehouses unless they exceed residential rooflines, which this doesn't. And finally, a statement from our insurer verifying the structure passed a safety inspection." Karen's face drained like someone had pulled a plug. "What safety inspection?" "Friend of mine from engineering school," I said, "does structural assessments. Certified." She scrambled to find a comeback. But the aesthetics." "Karen, you submitted a complaint that Leo's paint job was militant camouflage. It's pine green. That's suggestive." "Of what?" "Nature." The board fell into an awkward silence. Then Stephanie spoke. "Given this information, and since the county approved it, I don't see any enforceable violation." Doug nodded. "Yeah, me neither." Karen snapped. "This board is weak. If you won't protect this neighborhood, then I'll escalate." She stood and left in a huff, papers spilling out of her tote like confetti. Leo leaned over and whispered, "That was kind of fun." I whispered back, "She's not done." And she wasn't. The next day, a strange man with a clipboard knocked on our door. He introduced himself as a private inspector sent by an anonymous concerned resident. He asked to inspect the treehouse for safety hazard. I smiled. "Do you have jurisdiction?" "Not really." "Then no." I closed the door. An hour later, a drone hovered in our backyard. It buzzed around Fort Freedom, snapping photos. Leo waved at it with a grin, holding up a hand-painted sign that read, "Hi Karen." The drone zipped away. By that evening, I got an email from our HOA's legal proxy. Karen had submitted a formal nuisance claim against us. She also requested an emergency meeting with the HOA's insurance provider. Her new strategy was to declare the treehouse an attractive nuisance, a legal term for something dangerous that might lure children. I could see her logic forming. If she couldn't claim it was illegal, she'd try to claim it was dangerous and raise liability concerns until the board buckled. But she hadn't anticipated one small detail. The HOA's insurance provider? We owned it. Not directly, of course. That would be too obvious. But my cousin Everett, who I'd gone into business with after college, ran a regional insurance consortium. And guess who underwrote all of the HOA's policies after they'd had a minor flood issue last year? Everett owed me a favor. I made a quick call, sent over the complaint, and within 24 hours, the insurance rep emailed the entire HOA board with a formal response. Summary: the treehouse presented no increased liability risk under existing policies and was actually a positive indicator of community engagement. He even cited Leo's merit badge progress as a contributing factor to youth-driven civic improvement. Karen exploded. Figuratively. She sent a group email to the entire HOA. "I have had enough of the corruption." Then she scheduled yet another emergency board vote, this time to remove Leo's treehouse by force if needed. But she made one fatal mistake. In her panic, she attached a misdirected PDF meant for Doug, one she didn't realize was going to all of us. It contained her personal notes, including her real motivation. "If we let this stand, they'll think I've lost control of the neighborhood." It wasn't about safety, or regulations, or sunsets. It was about power, ego. When Officer Tran knocked on my door the next morning, he looked like a man trying not to laugh. I opened it with my usual coffee in hand and a tired smile ready to go. He held up a manila folder with a smirk. "Guess who filed a harassment complaint against you?" he said. "Let me guess." Frizzy hair, beige capris, clipboard surgically attached to her wrist. Tran nodded. "And she went full Shakespeare in the narrative. Said you're orchestrating a covert civil takedown of her leadership. That's almost poetic. I might embroider it on a pillow." He stepped inside, waving the folder. We had to open a formal file just to satisfy protocol, but the captain already flagged it as baseless. "There's nothing in here but drama and paranoia." "What exactly is she accusing me of?" Tran pulled out the complaint and read. "Subject has engaged in a campaign of retaliation via real estate ownership, civic manipulation, and personal humiliation." He paused. She actually used that phrase. Civic manipulation. What even is that? I raised my eyebrows. "I think it's when you build a treehouse and the neighborhood likes it more than her entire HOA existence." He chuckled and handed me a copy of the complaint. "We'll file it as closed. Just be prepared, she's spiraling." He wasn't wrong. By noon, Karen had posted a furious manifesto on the HOA Facebook page, accusing me of forming a shadow cabal to undermine her authority. She included cropped photos of me talking to neighbors, annotated with bright red text like "recruiting" and "secret deals." The photos included me handing a plate of cookies to Mrs. Daly across the street and shaking hands with the UPS guy. Leo and I printed the whole post out and added it to the growing scrapbook we'd titled Operation Fort Karen. We even gave it a leather cover. But things escalated that evening when I got a call from Everett. "I just had a woman show up at the insurance office demanding to review our contracts with the HOA," he said. "Let me guess. Blonde. Angry. Slightly moist with rage. She insisted we drop the HOA's coverage unless we void your undue influence. Said she'd expose us on social media and claimed we were funneling kickbacks to treehouse lobbyists." I burst out laughing. "Did you tell her we don't have treehouse lobbyists?" I told her the only lobbying we support is children not falling out of trees. Then I had security escort her out when she tried to photograph my receptionist. Karen was spiraling faster than a drain. I knew we were closing in on something big, something final. But she wasn't quite done yet. The next day, we all received glossy flyers stuffed into our mailboxes, clearly printed in bulk. The headline read, "Reclaim Our Neighborhood. Vote to remove Fort Freedom." Underneath, a heavily edited photo of the treehouse made it look like a dystopian outpost. She'd darkened the image, added fake graffiti, and superimposed storm clouds. I almost admired the effort. She announced an HOA-wide vote, to be held at a special community session that Saturday. Her goal was to force a removal under the Aesthetic Disruption Clause in the bylaws, a clause that hadn't been enforced in over a decade, and one that didn't apply to backyard structures unless they exceeded 16 feet, which ours didn't. But Karen was banking on fear, confusion, and the fact that most residents didn't know the rules. So I did what any long-game player would do. I knocked on doors. I didn't argue or debate. I just told the story. About how Leo had spent months building something with his own hands, how we'd ensured it was safe, legal, and meaningful. I brought pictures. I offered lemonade. I let them see the truth without pressure. But I wasn't the only one campaigning. Karen went door to door, too, but her strategy involved guilt, noise complaints, and long-winded monologues about community values. Several people told me she ended up shouting at them on their porches. One neighbor texted me, "She just compared your kid's treehouse to a meth lab. Is she okay?" Saturday came. The community center filled with folding chairs, stale coffee, and more tension than a town hall in a disaster movie. Karen was already there, wearing a sash that read HOA Chairperson in gold glitter, which I assumed she made herself. Leo sat beside me, wearing a polo shirt and a pair of aviator sunglasses, just to mess with her. He looked like a 12-year-old secret agent. I was proud. Karen stood at the front, clutching a stack of note cards like they were the Constitution. "This neighborhood is under siege," she began. "By neglect. By defiance. By unregulated structures that threaten our cohesion." The audience shifted uncomfortably. She advanced through her cards, building a case full of exaggerated metaphors and veiled insult. Do we want to become the kind of community where people just build things in trees and assume they can do whatever they like? Where children lord over our backyards from elevated platforms of authority? She dramatically turned toward me. "This is about power, about order, and about the preservation of a standard that keeps our property values strong." I stood, calm, collected. "May I respond?" Karen looked like she wanted to say no, but Doug, who had clearly lost all patience, waved me up. I walked to the front. "Let me tell you what this is really about. My son, 13 years old, spent 6 months building something with his own hand. He didn't spray paint it. He didn't blast music from it. He built it, from scrap and sweat, with help from neighbors who cared. It's safe, it's permitted, and it's not hurting anyone. But Karen isn't angry because it's dangerous. She's angry because she didn't control it." The room murmured. I continued. "Every complaint, every flyer, every meeting, it's all been about fear of losing authority. Not about safety. Not about community. And certainly not about aesthetics." Then I turned to Karen and added, "You said this was about preserving order. But what's more orderly than teaching a kid how to build something from nothing?" A hand raised in the crowd. Mr. Ellison, who'd lived on our street for 30 years. "I think the treehouse is fantastic," he said. "My grandson came over last week and couldn't stop talking about it. First time I've seen him put down his phone in months." Others nodded. A retired teacher stood up and said, "Leo asked me for advice on weight distribution. He made 3 blueprints before choosing one. That's initiative, not rebellion." One by one, people began speaking. Not everyone supported us, but more did than I expected. Karen's face turned into a mask of fury barely held together by glitter and desperation. Then Stephanie stood up. "Let's vote," she said. And we did. Secret ballots dropped into a locked box. Karen watched every one go in like it was being stolen from her soul. They counted in the hallway. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, Doug came back in with a clipboard. "By a vote of 31-4, he said, "the motion to forcibly remove the treehouse is denied." Applause broke out. Leo grabbed my arm and whispered, "Holy crap, we did it." Karen stood. "This is corruption," she screamed. "You've all been manipulated." She lunged for the ballot box like she planned to tear it open, but Tran, who had shown up quietly in the back, stepped forward and gently intercepted her. "Ma'am," he said, "don't make this your legacy." Karen froze, then turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, nearly tripping over the coffee table as she went. The letter was heavy. Not physically but metaphorically. It had that kind of bureaucratic weight that only comes with something expensive and stupid. Certified mail always means one of two things: someone died or someone wants to make your life hell. In this case, it was the latter, courtesy of Karen's latest descent into legally sanctioned madness. The envelope was from a law firm I'd never heard of, Bainbridge and Holloway, which sounded like a cartoon villain's side hustle. The return address was a P.O. box, which screamed cheap, and the paper inside was unnecessarily thick, like Karen believed that heavier paper would make her case stronger. I unfolded the complaint and skimmed it while sipping my coffee. By the time I finished, I had to put the mug down to stop myself from laughing and choking at the same time. Karen was suing me for intentional infliction of emotional distress, public defamation through social ridicule, negligent endangerment of minors, referring to Leo's friends visiting the treehouse, and most hilariously of all, conspiring with law enforcement to harass a private citizen. She had also tacked on claims of zoning violations, unlawful surveillance, which I assumed was her own drone's reflection in a window, and weaponized community influence. But the piece de resistance? She was suing the police department for complicity in neighborhood favoritism and enforcement negligence. I read that one twice just to be sure it wasn't a typo. Karen had apparently decided that since the police hadn't arrested me or bulldozed Leo's treehouse, they were part of a deep-rooted conspiracy to undermine HOA sovereignty. I called Officer Diaz. "Hey," I said. "So, you've been served?" "Yup," he groaned. "Our chief framed it and put it in the break room." "And Karen's suing the whole department?" "Technically just precinct leadership, but yeah. The captain said it's the funniest thing he's seen all year." "Are you guys, required to respond?" He chuckled. "Yeah. We're drafting a formal motion to dismiss and possibly countersue for frivolous litigation. The city attorney is actually excited. Says it's the most absurd civil filing she's read in a decade." That evening, I sat Leo down at the kitchen table and told him the basics of the lawsuit. He blinked. "She's suing me? You, me, and our local government." He leaned back, stunned. "What did I even do?" "You dared to be happy and ungoverned. That's her version of treason." Leo thought for a second. "Do I need a lawyer?" "Nope," I said. "We have one already. Remember Aunt Marissa? My godmother? She's a litigator." "No way." "Yup. And she has been itching for something ridiculous to sink her teeth into. Marissa, my older sister and a courtroom shark with an endless collection of stilettos and sharper comebacks, called me the next morning. "I saw the filing," she said. "This woman tried to use legal terminology like she found it in a word search. I am going to make her regret passing the 8th grade. I'd prefer we stay calm. I'll be civil. I didn't say I'd be gentle." Within a week, Marissa had filed a motion to dismiss the complaint with prejudice, citing insufficient evidence, baseless accusations, and a complete lack of standing. She also attached a 60-page appendix of neighborhood support, complete with statements from parents, teachers, and even the local fire inspector, who had done a voluntary walkthrough of Fort Freedom and declared it safer than most city park equipment. Karen, undeterred, doubled down. She held another HOA meeting, not to address community issues, but to announce that she was stepping down as chair to focus on the legal pursuit of justice. She framed it like a martyrdom, complete with a speech that compared herself to Erin Brockovich and Joan of Arc. In reality, she was pressured to resign after Doug and Stephanie realized she was draining HOA funds on private legal advice and bulk flyer printing. But she didn't vanish. She just got louder, from the outside. Her Facebook posts became more unhinged. She accused the city council of being infiltrated by anti-HOA radicals. She claimed the police station was operated by a shadow network of Treehouse sympathizers. She even tagged the mayor in a post titled, "When will you stand against the Fort of Anarchy?" To my absolute delight, the mayor replied, "I have 3 kids. They love the fort." Karen's post disappeared within minutes. The lawsuit crawled through court channels for 3 months. In that time, Karen became something of a legend in town. A local podcast did an episode called The Treehouse War, where Leo and I were interviewed about the experience. He handled it like a pro, explaining how he had learned about basic structural integrity, team coordination, and perseverance. I focused on the absurdity of bureaucracy weaponized by boredom. Karen responded by leaving a furious voicemail for the podcast hosts, accusing them of media bias and amplifying subversive construction culture. Meanwhile, Marissa was building a countercase. She quietly gathered screenshots, HOA financial records, and statements from members who'd been intimidated or harassed by Karen over the years. Then, 2 weeks before the hearing, she filed a cross-claim, seeking damages for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress against Karen. When Karen received the paperwork, she made a scene in the lobby of the county courthouse. She screamed about corruption. She accused the clerk of being in on it. She had to be escorted out by security again. The hearing was set for the following Monday. The night before, Leo stood on the treehouse's balcony and looked out over the neighborhood, lit by porch lights and late summer moon. "You think she's gonna show?" he asked. "She has to. It's her drama finale." He turned to me. "Do I have to say anything?" "Nope. Just sit with Aunt Marissa and try not to look too heroic." Court was, as expected, a mix of dry procedure and juicy implosions. Karen represented herself. That alone should have earned us the victory. She wore a blazer 3 sizes too large and opened with, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," only to be reminded by the judge that there was no jury. It was a motion hearing. She fumbled through her papers, mispronounced half the legal terms, and at one point referred to Leo as the boy who builds ladders to rebellion. Marissa sat still as stone until it was her turn. Then she stood, smiled, and calmly eviscerated every point with receipts, statutes, and 2 affidavits from building inspectors. The judge didn't even take it under advisement. He ruled immediately. All claims dismissed. Counterclaim for harassment may proceed. Court is adjourned. Karen stood frozen in place, stunned. "You can't do this." The judge had already left the bench. As we exited the courtroom, Leo fist-bumped Marissa. "You're like a lawyer ninja," he whispered. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Local news had picked up the story again, this time labeling it, "The HOA meltdown that went too far." They asked Karen for a comment. She shouted, "This isn't over," and fled to her car. They asked me if we were planning to sue her for damages. I looked at Leo, then at Marissa, and said, "We're not here to punish her. Just to make sure she finally stops punishing everyone else." But quietly I knew something else. Something Karen hadn't yet realized. She'd sued the police. And the city doesn't forget that. Because while she lost the lawsuit against me, there was another case building. I got the call 2 weeks after the court hearing. It came from the city attorney's office, and the woman on the other end of the line spoke in a crisp, no-nonsense tone that suggested she'd spent her entire career unraveling the messes made by people like Karen. "Mr. Grant, I'm reaching out to inform you that the city has officially filed charges against Karen E. Winthrop," she said. "Primarily under Section 18.9, falsification of public reports, obstruction of civic operations, and willful misuse of emergency services." I leaned back in my chair, nearly dropping the wrench I'd been using to help Leo upgrade the pulley system on Fort Freedom. "That's a lot more serious than a cease and desist letter." "It is. The department has determined that Ms. Winthrop knowingly filed false police reports, impersonated code enforcement officials on multiple occasions, and submitted fraudulent documentation during her civil complaint, including fabricated citations and doctored photographic evidence." I smiled, feeling the sweet, delayed rush of karma. "You're telling me she photoshopped my kid's treehouse into a war zone and thought nobody would notice?" "Yes. And she listed a non-existent treehouse watch list database in her complaint. That alone triggered a federal systems flag. That one made me sit up. Wait. Federal?" She claimed to have been in contact with DHS about domestic radicalization via suburban treehouses. I nearly choked. "Please tell me someone got that on record." "We have it on video. The FBI interviewed her last week. They referred the matter back to us, but she's definitely on a list now." It took everything in me not to run outside, raise a flag over Fort Freedom, and declare the land a sovereign victory. Instead, I calmly thanked her, hung up, and walked into the backyard where Leo was hoisting up a small cooler with the pulley. "Hey," I said. "You want to hear something hilarious?" The moment the charges became public, everything changed. Karen, once the unofficial queen of neighborhood passive aggression, suddenly became radioactive. Neighbors who'd once stood behind her now whispered about her at dog parks and walked past her house with their heads down. The HOA board issued a formal statement distancing itself from her actions, stating that her behavior had deviated from the values of the community association, and that they were shocked and dismayed by the revelations. Stephanie resigned the next day. Doug followed a week later, citing emotional burnout. And then came the most poetic turn of all, the lease for the HOA's office space. The tiny beige conference room in the Strip Plaza was abruptly revoked. Technically, my wife had just opted not to renew it, and legally, she wasn't required to explain why. Karen lost her last foothold of power. She still lived 2 blocks down, but her porch light rarely came on. Her trademark clipboard disappeared. For a while, we thought she might actually vanish into some HOA exile, never to be heard from again. But people like Karen don't go quietly. They stew. So when a notice went up on the community bulletin board announcing the formation of a new HOA council, complete with open elections and a reformed charter, I wasn't surprised to see her name at the bottom. She was running for chair again. But this time, so was I. It wasn't out of spite. Honestly, I never wanted to be in charge of anything involving paint colors, lawn lengths, or pergola height restrictions. But I also didn't want to live in a neighborhood where a kid's treehouse could be declared a weapon of mass disruption by someone with too much time and too little sense. Leo, of course, loved it. Dad for HOA chair became a running joke. He made campaign posters with slogans like "Vote Grant." Less drama, more hammocks and a treehouse in every yard. Our neighbor's teenage daughter printed shirts with my face on them and the phrase "In Forts We Trust." Karen launched her campaign with a 20-page manifesto titled Restore Order. It was full of coded language, vague threats, and veiled complaints about outsiders and non-conforming structures. She hosted wine and cheese nights where she ranted about moral decay and the silent war on community aesthetics. She handed out flyers at the farmers' market that accused me of turning children into rooftop anarchists. I showed up to the first debate in jeans and a Fort Freedom hoodie. Karen arrived in a pantsuit and pearls, holding a binder thicker than the town charter. Her opening remarks began with a Bible quote and ended with a diatribe about lawn gnomes. Mine started with, I'd just like to make sure no one's kids get sued for building a lemonade stand. By the time the second round of audience questions came, Karen was visibly sweating. Someone asked how she planned to repair community trust after recent legal troubles. She waved it off as media manipulation. Another asked whether she still believed the police department had been infiltrated by Treehouse radicals. She stammered, muttered something about national security, and tried to pivot to mailbox uniformity. I won in a landslide. A full 73% of the neighborhood voted. More than half wore Fort Freedom shirts to the polling station. The night the results were posted, Leo dragged a Bluetooth speaker into the backyard, queued up the Rocky soundtrack, and saluted me from the treehouse balcony. "We've taken the hill, General." I bowed. "Permission to raise property values, private?" "Permission granted." As the new HOA chair, my first act was to implement what I called the Common Sense Clause. It basically stated that no regulation could be enforced without actual harm, risk, or structural failure, and that tree houses under 16 feet were officially encouraged. I signed it into effect with a gold pen and a root beer in hand. Karen? She didn't show up to the first 4 meetings. When she did, she sat in the back, said nothing, and left before the minutes were read. Her house went up for sale 6 weeks later. But that wasn't the end of it. Not quite. You see, Fort Freedom had become more than just a treehouse. It was now a symbol, something kids in the neighborhood visited daily, where they traded baseball cards, built Lego fortifications, and plotted elaborate treasure hunts. Parents came too, helping Leo with a community compost project he'd pitched at one of the new HOA meetings. Even the mayor stopped by, took a selfie, and declared it the most productive government building in the county. Then, without warning, Leo came to me one afternoon and said, "Dad, I think it's time we build a second one." I blinked. A second what? A second treehouse. Bigger. Taller. But this time, for everyone. I stared at him, then at the original fort, now strung with fairy lights and scrawled signatures from every kid in the zip code. "You want to build a public one?" He nodded. "Right on the green lot. You said the HOA owns it now, right?" I laughed. "Technically, we do. And that's how Fort Freedom 2 began. This time we had volunteers, donations, even a retired contractor who helped with the base foundation. The local news came out to cover it. The headline read, "Neighborhood once torn apart by treehouse now united by one." Karen, if she was still around, never showed her face. And me? I stood back and watched a neighborhood rise out of lumber, laughter, and a complete lack of adult micromanagement. From a war over one treehouse came a community that finally understood what home was supposed to mean.